Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Krista Wetmore, and you're watching the Money Mindset Show. So, first week in September, and I thought, not that summer is over, but a lot of folks are getting ready, I guess, to close up cottages and in cottage season. So, I thought I would, I'm just moving my phone. I see there's some interference there. So I thought I would talk about vacation properties. So whether it's a summer property that you're closing up, or perhaps it's a ski chalet, or even a condo, and a lot of discussion that and clients have questions around how do I protect that family property, how do I pass that on to the next generation? And oftentimes, and especially around here, a lot of the cottages in this area anyway, have been passed down from generation to generation. So there's a few things that you want to consider before you leap into that. So I just want to touch on a few of those things today. So the first thing is, if you were to pass away, I guess, and what happens to that property? So for example, if you have a cottage and say you bought it 20, 30 years ago and you bought it for $100,000. And today it is worth $500,000. Well, if you passed away and if you wanted that to go to your children or someone else, as soon as you pass away, if you don't have a surviving spouse or common law partner that it could go to, it's called a deemed disposition. So the government's assuming that you had sold the property. So in selling the property at $500,000, you're triggering a capital gain of $400,000. Meaning that if you're in a high tax bracket, you would have to pay about a $200,000 tax bill for that property. So that's a huge chunk of cash. So you really need to plan on what steps can you take to reduce that tax trigger, and how can we look at some different options for you. So one of the things you can take a look at is at the principal residence exemption. And it doesn't have to be done right away, but something you could consider is that you're only allowed to have one property designated as a personal residence, your primary personal residence. And, it can get a little bit complicated. So I know I've had questions over the years and people will ask, can I just switch and use my cottage as my primary residence versus my home, because that would trigger less taxes? The complication comes into place when, say for example, I've had the cottage for 20 years, but also during that same time frame, I bought and sold many houses. So that muddies the waters a little bit, because then the government's looking at it and saying, okay, so if you claimed capital gains exemption on the buying and selling of the other properties you've owned, then is this one really your principal residence? So there's some calculations that would need to be done on that, and it may not be advantageous. So anyway, just something to keep in mind on the principal residence exemption. Something else that some people may not be aware of is, and again, when we're looking at an example I gave that I purchased a cottage 20 years ago for $100,000, what I want to do is try to preserve that adjusted cost base. And what that means is, so I bought the cottage for $100,000, 20 years ago, but I've put money into it. So I can adjust my cost base, so I'm using my adjusted cost base. It doesn't necessarily mean that I can claim everything. And what I'm allowed to add back in, for example, are capital expenditures. So for example, think tangible, I guess, items that or improvements on the property. So roof, perhaps there's new windows, doors, etc. So we're not talking sweat equity, talking tangible and large items, capital investment. You would need to hold your receipts for that. But again, just use an example. So I bought the cottage 20 years ago for $100,000. I made a ton of improvements to it. Some of the things I've just mentioned, roof, windows, and doors, and that's cost me, and I guess I'm exaggerating again, but let's just assume that's cost me $200,000. in expenses, and I have all my receipts for it. So all of a sudden, my adjusted cost base is $300,000 because I'm allowed to add back in those expenditures to my original purchase price. And then what I'm going to be taxed at would be the difference between the $300,000 and my fair market value today at $500,000. So, and that would only leave me with about $100,000 tax bill. So hopefully that makes sense. So again, if you do have cottages or condos or residents that are not your primary residence, make sure you're aware of that little fact, because it can save you quite a bit of money in the long run. Something that we also run into is insurance. So, for example, and let's just use the example of myself. So, let's pretend that my parents have a cottage that's been in the family for generations. They bought it 50 years ago for $100,000, and today it's worth $500,000. They pass away, and let's say that they both pass away. The cottage is deemed to be disposed of, so that's going to trigger a tax event. So the government decides that $500,000 less the $100,000 that they purchased it for, it's going to trigger $400,000 capital gain. So in that capital gain, let's just say, for example, that me as the beneficiary of that property is going to be left with a $200,000 tax bill. Yikes. And I don't know about a lot of you, but I don't have a couple $100,000 in cash sitting around to pay for that transfer. So that causes a few things. One is obviously a lot of angst to those that are left behind. What you don't want to have happen, if that's what your intent is, and if you have a property, is that you don't want to put the beneficiary in the position that they may have to sell that property or in order to pay the taxes, or that they'd have to sell the property at a fire sale price, at a reduced price, in order to pay the tax bill. So again, just a few things to keep in mind for that. One of the things that we can do to help mitigate that or reduce that, if, for example, if you know that your property is worth, or it's going to trigger a $200,000 tax bill for your beneficiaries or the folks that you want to leave your property to, it may be worthwhile investigating a life insurance policy for that amount. So if a life insurance policy was put in place for $200,000, then upon your death, that cash would go to pay for or pay it to offset that tax bill. So that's something that we do quite often and encourage, we speak with our clients about. One thing I'm just looking at my notes here. One thing that is oftentimes is mistaken is gifting a residence to somebody during your lifetime. And let me just put it bluntly, as much as we want to try to get around taxes, there's some things that they're just hard to do so. So for example, let's just pretend that I have a cottage and I want to pass it on to my two children. So I'm trying to be a little sly here. I'm going to add the two kids on to the title. So it's going to be joint between the three of us, and in the attempt to try to get around the taxes. But no, that doesn't work either, because what happens, even though if you're going to be adding somebody onto the cottage, that could be seen as a deemed disposition as well. And in this case, because I'm adding two people on, the capital gains would be triggered about like a 2/3 capital gain, and then upon my death, the rest of the capital gain would be triggered. So that's oftentimes a little mistake, I guess, that people assume that if I just add somebody else's name onto the property title, that is not going to trigger a capital gain, and that's not necessarily the case. So let me take a look at one of the things here that I noted down and I want to talk about as well, because sometimes, so for example, if you are thinking of selling a property, I guess, or how do you pass that on to your children? One of the things that I think is often overlooked, and it's one of the things that obviously we love to jump into, sort of, taxation and estate planning. But I'm just going to back up for a second, because if you do have a property, don't necessarily assume that the folks that you want to leave the property to actually want it, because sometimes that's not the case. They may not live in the same province anymore. They may have different interests, or want to do different things with their free time. So you want to have those discussions before you start planning, planning this. You want to make sure that the folks, again, whether it's your children or others, that you're leaving your property to, actually do want the property. And the other thing to consider too is, how do you, so for example, I've seen this case as well, where all good intentions, parent passes away, last remaining parent passes away, they leave the cottage to 3 children, and things are good for a year or two, and then gee whiz, some squabbles start to happen. So what do you do with that? Because the 3 names are on the title of that property. So there's some squabbles over, well, I want the property from middle of July until middle of August. And my sister says, well, that's not fair, because those are the best weeks of the whole summer. And so what are you going to do? So what are you going to do then? Or if the roof is leaking and it needs to be replaced, well, who's going to pay for that? I don't want to pay for that, because I just put a brand new deck on the cottage. Maybe one of my other siblings should pay for it. So there's a lot of issues that can pop up, even if it comes to divorce. So if one of the siblings becomes divorced, does that, give the ex-spouse a legal right to the property as well? Or, if one of the siblings were to pass away, what does that mean for that legacy? So does their share get passed to their children, or does it stay, with the original heirs to the property? So a lot of different things you need to consider like that too, because the last thing that you want, and I've seen it over and over again, is that oftentimes good intentions lead to some little squabbles and family disputes over things that really should have been talked about beforehand. And in the event that, for example, that you were thinking of leaving the cottage or the ski chalet to your children, and if you have a few different, few children, it may be worth to investigate having a co-ownership agreement. And it's basically just a legal document that's going to specify, all the different conditions that I've just mentioned, and that helps prevent any squabbles down the road. And again, oftentimes people do things with great intentions, and unfortunately, leads to some hardship and some family dynamics down the road, for sure. And the other thing that you may want to consider too, especially if you are thinking of selling a property, and I just had a case recently that was brought to my attention where an individual thought, I'm going to sell my property now to one of my children. And the thing you want to take into consideration with that is, again, your fair market value. So don't try to, I guess my advice is not to try to protect the child by giving them a deal. So let's use the example of the cottage again. I love to use big numbers because I find it's a great example. So let's say the cottage is worth $500,000. And I think, my goodness, I want to give my child or sell that to my child for $100,000. but that sale is going to trigger a capital gain. So I'm going to have to pay $200,000 again on that sale. So I'm being triggered for a capital gain of $400,000, assuming I'm in a high tax bracket. It's going to trigger a $200,000 capital gain for me. And what it's going to do for my child is they're purchasing it for $100,000. So then at some point when they sell it, you don't want to be in a position where you're going to be double taxed. So I've paid the capital gains tax, and then upon the sale of the property, again, my child would have to pay the property gains tax. So you don't want to pay double. You don't want to pay more than you have to, and you sure as heck don't want to pay twice. And the other thing you may want to do too, and I've sat down with some lawyers and we've had some discussions on this, is that if you're looking at selling a property to a child, and let's face it, I mean, you don't want to trigger, again, if it's a $200,000 tax bill, that's a lot of money. And, do you want to pay that right away? Or is there something, could you structure it so it's a sale over a 5-year period? So then you're deferring that capital gains over a 5-year period of time versus paying it all in one long shot. So that's something that could also be discussed with the legal professional. And for some reason, hopefully the video here I just looked at the screen a couple times and I saw it was not working too well. So hopefully this video has come through clear, and hopefully that gives you some examples of what to do with your cottage property, vacation property, when you're thinking of succession planning, or even if you're just planning on selling it yourself. And wrapping things up. So hopefully, again, just to kind of summarize, hopefully you understand what it means when you're either pass away, or if you're selling a property, or if you're adding somebody's name on a property. You just want to be aware of the capital gains that it could trigger, as well as, does it make sense to use it as your principal residence to try to avoid taxation, or is that going to create more problems for you if you've had other homes in the past that you've bought and sold over that period of time that you've owned the cottage? And as well, if you are, thinking of long-term sort of estate planning, financial planning, what to do to try to, again, to reduce the tax burden on those individuals, the heirs of your property, think about, consider life insurance product, and that's exactly what it's designed for. And I know sometimes I've made recommendations also to clients that, if it's a larger premium and you're not comfortable paying for it, but you want to make sure that the children are not going to be left with, $200,000 tax bill for the cottage, then maybe get them to pay the premium on your behalf, because at the end of the day, they're going to be getting the cottage. So there's always a lot of different things that we can discuss and sort of provide some direction when you're considering these options. So I just want to wish everyone a great day. Thanks for joining me again today at the Money Mindset Show, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.